Well, hey y'all, thanks for joining us today. Are you ready for a little rose culture and history? Well, Dr. Malcom Manners joins us to talk about his work with Rose Mosaic Virus, as well as the beautiful rose gardens and collections of roses at Florida Southern College. He'll also chat with Teresa about the history behind some of those roses. And after listening to today's episode, you'll know why Dr. Manners was awarded the Great Rosarian of the World Award in 2013. Y'all stay with us. The Rose Chat podcast starts now.
It's time for the Rose Chat podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris Van Cleef and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Try Haven brand soil conditioners, providing generations of gardeners with a truly all-natural alternative to chemical fertilizers with their line of composted manure and alfalfa teas. Easy to brew and use on all indoor and outdoor plants. Find them online at manuretea.com.
Dr. Manners has been teaching at Florida Southern College since 1981 and specializes in fruit production, roses, and techniques of propagation of various crops. Since 1996, he has participated in 14 USAID-funded farmer-to-farmer volunteer missions to developing countries. This amazing program works to help alleviate extreme poverty through education on better crop production methods. And countries he's worked with are Ethiopia, Egypt, India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and there's many more. He is also very active in the preservation of heirloom genetic resources for roses and serves as a trustee of the Heritage Rose Foundation. And it's no surprise that in 2013, he was awarded the Great Rosarian of the World for his many years of work on Rose Mosaic Virus disease and as an educator in the field of rose culture. Hello, Malcom. Welcome to Rose Chat.
Well, hi, Teresa. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. And since you're so involved in the world of roses, my next question is, how'd you get started being interested in roses at all?
I came to Florida Southern to teach horticulture in 1981, and I was listening the other day to your podcast with Mike Shoup, and Mike said that he started out his career with no interest in roses. I was kind of in that same situation. I was interested in fruit crops and other things you could eat, and thought roses were kind of a silly pastime. But then my boss, Dr. Rupert Pravat, who was a district director with the American Rose Society and a long-term judge, he invited me to a rose show. And him being the boss and me being the new employee, it was one of those situations where you can't say no. So I decided to go to this rose show and suffer through something that I knew would be horrendous. Well, I got there, and at first I thought, yeah, this was horrendous. And then I went down an aisle that had the old garden rose displays, and I smelled a fragrance that took me on one of those childhood memories back to my grandmother's house. And I tell people I fell in love instantly. I thought, I have to grow that. I need to find what it was first, which meant going down the road, sniffing all the roses, and had no idea there even were old roses at that time. I thought there were just cut flower type hybrid teas. So I very quickly got educated on that and found a mail order nursery. This is before the time of Mike Shoup's nursery, but there was a mail order nursery that was selling old roses. And I ordered a little over a dozen of them, planted them in my garden here in Lakeland, Florida. And the next spring, they all burst out in the most interesting, you might say, beautiful yellow variegation all over the leaves, which I showed to my boss and said, what's going on here? And he said, oh, you've got Rose Mosaic Virus on those. And I had never heard of that, being new to roses. And so I said, well, what can you do about it? And he said, well, there's really nothing you can do about it in your garden. There are places institutionally where they have the equipment to treat them. And so I got to questioning him more about that and realized that we had in the room next to my office the exact equipment I would need. And I said, well, why don't we start such a program? And he said, well, I don't have time to do it, but if you want to do it, have at it. So I believe it was late 83 or early 84, we started our Rose Mosaic heat therapy program at the college, and that has grown ever since to now growing more than 400 varieties on the campus.
Wow, that's impressive. I've had Rose Mosaic, and so I'm very interested in this subject. And one of the first things that happens is I see a variation on the leaves, and there could be lots of different things, iron, all sorts of things. So my first question about that is, how do we know for sure if we have it?
The symptoms are variable from one variety to another, but with an iron deficiency or manganese or something like that, the yellow chlorosis is usually pretty symmetrical following the veins. Whereas with mosaic, you often get a zigzag leaf pattern that crosses veins. That's a very different looking thing. They may also have patches of yellow or sometimes white on the leaf, and those are often bordered by a vein. So it'll be bright yellow on one side and you cross the vein and it's back to normal green. So if you see symptoms like that, those are probably mosaic. And it's difficult on an audio only broadcast to say, if you see that, you've got it, because I realize my description may not have been adequate. But if you look up pictures of it, you can probably see what I'm talking about. There's really nothing else that looks like that. So if you see those symptoms, your plant does have mosaic. The fact that you don't see it on a bush, though, does not mean that the plant doesn't have it, because one of the unfortunate characteristics about this disease is it often doesn't show any symptoms, even though it is damaging the bush in the long run. They're less cold hardy for people who are farther north. We don't worry about that in Florida, but in the north, that would be very important. They're not as vigorous. They don't make as many flowers. The flowers are smaller. They're on shorter stems. All the things we want to grow a rose for, mosaic damages. And so even if you're not seeing leaf symptoms, it is of concern.
So if we see leaf symptoms and we've got it identified, so what should we do next? Is it like rose rosette that we need to dig the bush, or is it something that's going to spread? So what do we do next? I know you've had speakers in the past about rose rosette, and that's a very different thing. It's also a virus, and there's a problem. People often say, well, this rose has virus, or this rose doesn't have virus. And I think it's important, particularly today when we've all got COVID on the mind, to realize that not every virus is the same as every other virus. And that's true in roses also. So rose rosette is ultimately deadly to the bush and highly contagious, carried by mites. Rose mosaic is not like that. It normally doesn't kill the bush outright, and it's not contagious. People have seen this disease in their gardens in the U.S. since at least the 1920s. We have records of it. To date, here now, 100 years later, we still don't have a documented record of even one case of spread in a garden. It truly is not contagious. The way it moves around in the rose crop is at the nursery level, because it's easily moved across a graft union. So in a nursery, if they start out with an infected rootstock and then graft or bud a healthy scion on top, it will come down with the disease. If they put a healthy scion onto uninfected rootstock, it will come down with the disease. So it moves very easily through a graft union. And by doing that over the years, the nursery industry put it into most of the varieties we were growing. I've heard it estimated that in the 1970s, more than 90% of the U.S. crop was infected. Today, I don't know a percentage. I'm going to say it's much less than that, but probably in the 30 to 40% range. I'm kind of making that up, but that's just based on what I tend to see. Mm-hmm. So it's still a serious problem, but less of a problem than it had been, because the nursery industry, in many cases, really has worked to clean up their crop. Well, So if our rose is performing and we're still getting good blooms and that sort of thing, it's doing what we want it to do, then we're good to leave it where it is.
Yes, that's exactly right. The one reason you might want to consider replacing it is if you could get a healthy plant of the same variety, it's likely to perform better for you. So it is worth replacing, but there's no emergency to do that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. That's really good news. So that answers a lot of questions that I've had, and I've gotten some advice through the years that maybe hasn't been as true, but I've heard that it was contagious, and I've heard that it wasn't. So now we've got straight from the horse's mouth. And,
let me clarify something right there, if I may. There, as is true of anything on the internet, there are people who become fanatical believers in things and promote their concept, and people believe them. And there is the rumor out there that it's highly contagious and moving around from bush to bush. The evidence they're using for that, as is so often with such rumors, there's a little evidence behind them and they're misinterpreting it. There was a test done at the University of California at Davis where they planted roses very close together, just inches from each other. And it did spread in that row. But what they found out when they dug those up was that the roots were naturally grafting to each other between bushes. So again, it was a graft union that was spreading it. But when you plant them at rose garden distances, we've never heard of a rose actually making a graft union with the next rose over. That doesn't seem to happen.
Well, when you said that close together, my first thought was, oh, this is going to be a root situation. When they're that close, they're going to cross over. Yeah. Well, let me say thank you for all the backyard gardeners out there for your report on Mosaic and your work. We sure appreciate it, and I'm glad to get the news that it is not contagious. So, and I'm sure that if you're going to show a rose and you want nicer leaves and that kind of thing, it would definitely be worth your while to look for a healthy plant.
Oh yes, yeah, definitely. You're as I said, you're likely to get bigger flowers, longer stems, and then of course you won't have the stripes on the leaves. Mm-hmm. I wonder, should I talk a bit about what we do to actually cure a plant?
Absolutely.
As Dr. Pravat told me back in the day, there's nothing you can do in your garden to cure a plant other than just replace it. But what we do, viruses don't like hot weather, just like plants and people don't. And so it's a matter of producing a plant, usually about a 2-gallon size pot, and then we hold it in a heat chamber at 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a month. And day and night, it never goes below that. Mm-hmm. Now, even though there are places, and for example, out west right now, they're having a big heat wave where they're getting daytime temperatures well above 100. Even in those places, the temperature drops cooler than 100 at night. So there's really no place on the earth where a continuous 100 degrees would happen for a full month. And under those conditions, the virus dies out. It can't handle that. And sometimes the rose also dies. But if you manage to keep the rose alive for that full month, then you can cut wood from the top of it and graft it onto a healthy rootstock. And in most cases, the new plant will test clean when we test it. The plant that comes out of the heat chamber is not cured because being in that hot weather, we have to keep watering it. And every time you water it, the temperature of the roots drops below 100. And so the virus often does not die out of there. But that's how we end up producing a clean plant. And then if you're buying plants from a nursery, ask them if their plants have been indexed for Rose Mosaic. And the good, honest nurseries will be happy to tell you. And in most cases, if it's an old rose nursery, not all of their stock will have been indexed, simply because we at Florida Southern are about the only place in the world that's doing old roses, and we simply haven't done them all. There are so many of them out there. And so, but they're likely to have some known certified roses, and they will say to you, well, yeah, this one has been virus indexed. Sometimes they call them VI, sometimes they call them clean, sometimes they call them virus-free. And it's worth just asking them what they mean by that if you see that in their catalog.
Yeah, I have seen that, and I thought, oh, which virus is that, and what does that really mean? And so, but some do advertise that, so it is worth looking into it for a healthy plant for sure.
The other big organization that does heat therapy is the University of California at Davis. And they've done most of the hybrid teas and floribundas and more of the modern roses. So we've more specialized in my program with the antique varieties. We don't want to overlap Davis too much. They're doing a great job. Their program is very much larger than ours. But between these two institutions is where pretty much all of the certified clean crop in the U.S. comes from.
Boy, that's wonderful. Good news there for sure. And I'm so glad we're doing the old roses. You know, sometimes what's in the past just kind of gets passed over, but I'm like you. I can smell the rugosas and some of the old roses in my garden, and I'm transformed back to childhood and hedgerows around my great-grandmother's yard and things I found in there. And I didn't know there were roses in there as a child, but when I smell them today, I know there were roses there.
Right.
Yeah. So we don't want to lose that.
Right.
You've used your talents and your resources for so many worthy projects, but since I've actually visited the roses in the New York Rose District, I want to hear about your work that you've been involved with there in Harlem.
That is a fun topic. Back in, I'm going to say around 2008 or 9, probably, Stephen Scaniello and Betty Vickers were off on a hunt for the graves of famous Rosarians, including Harrison of Harrison's Yellow and several others. And they came across a cemetery, the Trinity Cemetery in Harlem. If you ever want to visit it, it's at Broadway and 55th, big cemetery there. And got the idea of a Heritage Roses district. And they had a reporter and photographer from the New York Times with them, and they did a special gardening article. And Scott Stringer, who was the president of the borough of Manhattan at the time, got behind it. And they created this project to plant gardens throughout Harlem, other parts of New York too, but mainly Harlem, with roses that were appropriate to the period of the architecture of those neighborhoods. And so needing large numbers of roses to do that, Stephen, of course, got in contact with a number of the old rose nurseries, many of whom very happily donated plants. But he also talked to us at Florida Southern. We offer a bachelor's degree in horticultural science. And so my students are always propagating roses, among other things. And so we produced, I think now it's well over 1,000 roses that we've sent or taken to New York. And then Stephen got the idea that maybe we should start bringing students as a service learning work project. And so starting, I believe, in 2010 or 2011, we have taken students usually every spring to plant roses, to prune the ones that are already there, to weed the beds, mulch them, that sort of thing, all over Harlem. We do that on a long weekend. Of course, we haven't been able to with COVID, but we're hoping to go back to that. So it's a great experience for the students, and there are some really beautiful rose gardens now throughout Harlem because of that.
My daughter and I spent a beautiful, very hot July day doing what you described, looking for the grave of George Harrison, the father of the Harrison Jello, because it's a big rose in our family. It was important to us, and I sort of felt like I was a family member standing at his gravesite. So we had Stephen on the phone. He couldn't join us, but we had so much fun. And we were just amazed at how many beautiful roses were there, and they were just peppered throughout Harlem. So we got to walk around and see them, and it's just such a historical, beautiful place. That it was a lovely day, and I'm so thankful. I didn't know then that you had done that, but it is. I enjoyed it immensely, and I would say that anyone would enjoy, any rose lover would enjoy that tour for sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you told me when we had talked before that there's a huge specimen of Harrison Jello on the banks there, on the fence there behind his gravestone. But it was July; he had already bloomed, so we didn't get to see it.
Yeah, that's a gorgeous rose, but the downside is it blooms early and then it stops. So, yeah, it would have just been a green bush when you were there.
Yeah, it was. And you know that spring has arrived because it's usually first. And
Right.
You can smell it. In my garden, to me, it smells like honey. So,
Yeah.
well, let's change locations now, and we'll talk about some roses in Florida. So, Florida Southern is known for beautiful gardens, and so we want to hear about them.
Okay. Well, when we started the heat therapy program, we realized we were going to have a planting area to maintain our virus cured roses. And so we planted a garden of about 50 plants, and that did well for a while. And then we ended up with more than 50 different varieties. And so we needed another space. So that first garden was planted in the early 80s. And then in the 1990s, we planted another garden with space for another 150. And that lasted well until around, I think it was 2012. I had a notification from the college administration that they were going to remove the big garden, that they wanted to use that land for a different purpose. And they assured me they would provide at least as much space for a new garden. And could I please plan to move the garden? Well, transplanting roses, as you may know, in Florida, we tend to grow our roses on Fortuniana rootstock. It's a wonderful root system, but it does not transplant well if you have a big old bush. And so I spent the next year and a half grafting new plants. We propagated the entire collection, moved them into pots behind the greenhouses, and for a little over a year, the collection existed in 5 or 7 gallon pots. And in the meantime, they did find a great spot for a new garden. And the treasurer of the college said to me, "So can you design and plant such a garden?" And I said, I could, but Florida Southern is the home to the world's largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. And since the time of Wright, we also have a number of buildings by Stern from, I believe he's at Yale. So famous architecture anyway. And I said, do you really want me, I'm a horticulturist, not a designer, designing a garden? I could plant some roses, but I would suggest that you get a name value designer who we know does good work. And so I keep talking here about Stephen Scaniello, and they said, well, we don't know such a person. And I said, well, I do. And so they hired Stephen, and he came in and he stood on the site, and he looked around and he said, so this is a site where I can see Frank Lloyd Wright on one side, a really ugly parking lot on one side, a building that reminds me of the state penitentiary on one side, and an Italian Renaissance garden on the fourth side. And you want me to create a garden that blends all of those? And I said, yes, that's right. And he said, okay, I think we can do that. So he designed what we now call Ruth's Rose Garden. Dr. Charles Thrift was a president of the college in the 50s through the 70s. And we have a lot of things on campus named in his memory. But his children realized that there was nothing on the campus to memorialize their mother, Ruth Thrift. And so they were looking for a place to invest in a significant memorial to their mom. At the same time, we were interested in planting this garden. And so it worked out very well. So it is Ruth's Rose Garden. Ruth is Dr. Thrift's wife, Mrs. Thrift. And so it now holds about 300 plants with lots of space for big climbing roses. I didn't have that before. And it's really a showpiece of the campus. It's a great collection. So between that garden, and we still have the old original garden that had 50 roses, it's been redesigned, so it has 60 in it now. So we have about 360 plants on the campus, and then we maintain a good number more varieties in the greenhouses. So overall, we have about 400 varieties on our campus. And they're not all virus-free, but we know which ones are and which ones aren't. We do test them. And so the idea, of course, is to clean up those that need it, and then we make propagating material available to the nursery industry, not only in the U.S., but I think we've shipped material to 5 or 6 other countries. And so that's how the material gets distributed around the world. We have in the garden several special collections. The musk rose that Shakespeare wrote about in Midsummer Night's Dream, Act 3, was in Ophelia's garden, I believe. was thought to be lost for many years. And then Graham Stewart Thomas rediscovered it in England. And it was also rediscovered in the American South by Leonie Bell and John and Marie Butler and Ruth Knopp in Virginia and North Carolina and a few places in South Carolina. And so we have a complete collection of all of the various finds of the true musk rose, including the English one. And I don't know of anywhere else that has a collection like that. And then we also have a collection of the so-called Bermuda mystery roses in Bermuda, which is a subtropical climate. People think of it as being down in the Caribbean, but if you look on your map, Bermuda is actually directly east of North Carolina, but out in the middle of the Atlantic. So they never get frost, but they do get a cool season. And they have this group of roses they call the Bermuda mystery roses that are either very old varieties, probably brought from Europe, whose identity has been lost, or they may be seedlings that occurred on Bermuda. But in any case, they are well adapted to a windy climate that often gets salt spray from hurricanes. They have poor alkaline soils. It's a challenging place to grow roses, and yet these have been survivors. And so because they will do well in poor soil with salt in a climate that is for a good part of the year hot, we thought they might do well in Florida. So one year my parents and I visited there as a vacation, and I brought back under federal permit cuttings of the various roses. And so after they went through the 2-year federal quarantine, they were put into our gardens. And there are a lot of nurseries in the U.S. today that specialize in old roses that sell the so-called Bermuda mystery roses. As far as I know, almost all of those have come through our program. And it's a great group of roses, mainly teas, chinas, a few noisettes. So probably they would not do well in the far north, but in areas that are warm enough to grow those classes, they're great roses. Very low maintenance. They're usually black spot resistant and just good roses. And then we have a collection of Viru Viraragavan's roses. He's an Indian breeder, and he uses Indian tropical species, especially Rosa gigantea and Rosa clinophylla, to develop roses that will do well in humid heat. And again, we thought, well, that's like our conditions. And so we've trialed a good number of his roses, some of which are just real stars in our gardens. They're great roses.
You have described a place that is now on my bucket list. And when we get to moving around, I'm going to make my way. The collections you've described, excuse me, are just amazing. I'm just so excited about this work. I just want to see. I want to see those musk roses. So what's bloom time for them?
I'm hoping we can soon invite everybody back. That we've been officially closed because of COVID, but of course, once that's gone, probably there are 2 good times to see the roses. We start cooling off in early October, and we usually do a light deadheading then. And so we often have pretty good roses mid to late November on the campus, but the real peak bloom is usually the first 2 weeks in April, and it's an amazing place then. We have flowers throughout most of the rest of the year. We do tend to prune heavily in late February, so from then through March you wouldn't see much other than pruned roses coming back. But starting then in April and right up until we prune again in February, we have at least something in bloom all the time. But those would be the 2 peak times, late November and then again early April.
Oh, perfect. Well, you talked a little bit about care, but let's give our listeners some tips on growing roses in those hot, humid conditions.
Okay. Probably our number one problem traditionally has been black spot disease. And of course, it loves hot, humid, rainy weather. We've had 6 inches of rain in the last week. And so that's we're going to have black spot everywhere. And so you really have 2 choices there. You can grow resistant varieties, or you can plan to spray regularly. The college does fund a spray service that sprays my gardens once a week. So we can grow even the susceptible ones. But if you don't want to do that, you really should look for black spot resistance. On the other hand, we have no problem at all with rose rust. I've seen it twice in my life, and it cured itself. And we very seldom have a problem with powdery mildew either, maybe for a couple weeks in the late winter, early spring, but otherwise black spot's the real problem there. In recent years, we've also developed a problem with a small insect called a chili thrips. That's not the same as the flower thrips that everybody has, but it feeds on the stems and the leaves. And that one is a real challenge because not only can it be devastating to a rose, but there seems to be something genetic in roses that if they are very resistant to black spot, they will not be very resistant to chili thrips. So for example, two of the most black spot resistant roses that I know of would be Knockout and Belinda's Dream. They're both absolute martyrs to chili thrips. It will kill them to the ground just in a matter of weeks. So in that case, again, you can select for resistance or you can spray. The problem there is if you're looking for resistance to black spot and chili thrips, you're really down to only one variety that I know of, and that's Smith's Parish from Bermuda. I've never met another rose that was resistant to both. And that's really unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. And unfortunately, we don't have good biological controls for the chili thrips. So that's kind of a bummer, but that's our situation. I did mention that we grow most of our roses on Fortuniana rootstock, just slightly north of here, where they start getting some clay in their soil. They can do very well with own root roses. We are on an ancient pile of prehistoric beach sand, and so our soils are absolutely horrible. And that means we have a high population of nematodes that feed on the rose roots. And Fortuniana is nicely resistant to that. Now, we do also, when we plant a rose, we put a lot of organic matter in the planting hole, compost or potting soil or cow manure or something like that. And by a lot, I mean I will use 20 gallons under one bush. So we're really replacing the soil they're going to grow in. And then we keep them heavily mulched with an organic mulch. We've been using pine straw in recent years. In the past, I've used pine bark. I've used pine needles. I like all of those, but that keeps renewing your organic matter in the soil. Even so, they tend to do better, I think, with Fortuniana for us. So because we're in bloom most of the year, except when we prune, we do keep them fertilized throughout the year. And as I say, we have a spray service that sprays for black spot weekly. And when we see chili thrips building up, they will add something to control them as well. We try to avoid any more insecticides than we have to, but in some cases we have to. One nice thing also about our very rainy climate is we almost never see spider mite injury in the garden. So that's a good aspect of growing them in Florida.
Now here in the Midwest, we do not have chili thrips yet. I'm sure they'll find us eventually, but the Japanese beetles have found us, and every summer we just have to give up bloom. It's just disappointing that we have to give up our blooms for several weeks. Sometimes we get into months that the Japanese beetles just are crazy. They're big and they're fat and they're ugly, and so we drown them. I don't spray for them. It doesn't seem to help at all. Back in the years when we did spray a bit, but we drown them in soapy water and try to keep them from recreating themselves.
I think that points out that when you talk about how do you grow roses, the first question should be, well, where do you live and where do you grow them? Because our growing situations are not the same. Mm-hmm. And we don't have Japanese beetles. They are found outside the Orlando and Tampa and Miami airports every year, but they don't reproduce here. And so we're lucky in that sense. And you may be lucky that it may be cold enough that you won't have chili thrips. So you kind of have to, I always say, ask somebody in your area who's a good rose grower. They're going to know better than I will, particularly if the person is far away from where I live, for the best advice. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you have a local rose society, they're going to be your go-tos.
Yes.
Our Rose Society is filled with people who are new to roses, but also people who've been growing roses from 30 to 40 years. And so there's so much help there. And the American Rose Society has a website, and you can find information there at rose.org. And they can actually help you find someone locally if you contact the national organization. So those are good resources for anyone, wherever you are.
Right.
Well, I'm telling you, we've covered a lot, and this has been just fantastic. But let's move on to your favorites. You've got all this beauty around you, so you've got the history of growing. So, what are your favorite roses?
I once heard the famous British nurseryman Peter Beals say when he was asked that question, "It's the rose I'm looking at the moment." And I'm tempted to quote Peter. If you look closely at any rose, you'll see its good characteristics and say, "Well, I think that's my new favorite." But if we rephrase that to say, if I could only have a small garden with a few roses, what would I not want to live without? That one's easier to answer. I think my first choice would be Mrs. B.R. Kant, which is a pinkish red tea rose. It is a very large growing bush. You have to have space for it. But we know it has been on our campus since before 1953. And that particular bush only is no longer with us because it was cut down. They didn't want it there. Otherwise, it would probably still be there. And it does very well for us. And so it's a favorite of mine. Also, I mentioned the musk rose. I love the musk rose because of its fragrance. It's a very strong fragrance, and I would want certainly to have that in my garden. And then if I were picking a third one, it would probably be the rose that we call Maggie. And I don't remember if Mike Shoup mentioned that on your program or not, but Mike is one.
I believe he did.
He's really promoted that one in the U.S. It was found in the garden of Dr. Bill Welsh's mother-in-law, whose name was Maggie. And so Bill, not knowing what it was, gave it that name. And that's the name that has stuck with it in the U.S. The interesting thing about that rose is it has also been found among the Bermuda mystery roses. They call it Pacific rose. It has been grown for a long time in India as the Kakinada red rose. And then, as you said, I've done a lot of volunteer work in developing countries. I was in Bangladesh one time, and in an area where I had never been before, and my translator knew that I didn't know anybody there. And we stopped at a restaurant for lunch, and I said, "Give me a minute. I'm going to go speak to a friend here across the parking lot." I think he thought I was losing it. But there was a big bush of Maggie growing in this Bangladeshi parking lot. I've also seen it growing in Myanmar. So whatever it is, it has been around for a long time and made its way around the world. It is a pinkish purple. We call it a bourbon. We don't know its background, but it grows like a bourbon, kind of like a souvenir de maison. Mm-hmm. And it blooms all the time. It's very disease resistant. Just a wonderful rose, and so I like it a lot. It does get some chili thrips, but that it's somewhat resistant to black spots, so it is chili thrips susceptible. But that's a rose that I think I would not want to be without. So those would be my three top choices, I think. Otherwise, teas and chinas in general do really well for us, and I like most of them. Lady Hillingdon, for example, is another favorite.
Oh my, those are so beautiful. Pictures and stories of B.R. Kent led me to, stretch the zone a bit and try it in my garden. She didn't make it through the winter, but I enjoyed her while she was here and got a few blooms. Got a few blooms out of her. But Maggie, I'm not sure about the zones on Maggie, but it sounds like maybe I need to try that. But, I was just thinking, as you've told so many wonderful stories today, if you love beauty, it's in roses. If you love fragrance, it's in roses. If you love history and amazing stories, you can find that in roses.
That's right. Yeah.
It's all there. It is a whole package. And that's what I love so much. I love that visitor that comes to the garden and has enough time to hear the stories behind some of the roses in my garden. If it's just where they came from and why I grow them, it's those stories. And you've told so many beautiful stories. And Maggie and showing up in Bermuda. I mean, was it Maggie that showed up in Bermuda?
Yes.
And
they call it Pacific
in Bangladesh. Oh, my goodness. I mean, seriously. Yeah, it's a beautiful world. And we're connected in ways that we just didn't know. And we found out this last year for sure. We've been connected by a virus.
Right.
We certainly have. But, just to find that on your trip, I mean, that is amazing. I love that story so much. I'm going to treasure that one. Well, this has been great. It's just been so good to have you here today. And thanks for taking the time. I think we could talk for hours to cover everything we want to cover, but this has been just fabulous, and I so appreciate you coming.
Well, it's been great fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I can certainly see why you were awarded the Great Rosarian of the World. I mean, you have done so much and you do it beautifully, and I can't wait to come and visit your gardens.
Well, thank you. I hope you will, and I hope your listeners will come and see us as well. It's a good garden to visit. It's open to the public all the time when we're not under COVID restrictions, and we certainly welcome you. If you give us some advance warning, we might be able to arrange a tour, but it's open anytime. You can just walk in.
Is that kind of information on the website? Where could we find that?
If you go to the college website, flsouthern.edu, there is a map of the campus, and so you can get the locations. There's really not a page there about the rose gardens, and there probably should be.
So it's a great idea. So we can find you.
Yeah. Yes.
Find you easy.
And it's the campus is worth exploring anyway for the Frank Lloyd Wright. So, it's a small campus, so you could see the whole thing in half a day.
We'll get some of those links and that information. You can send me a little bit of information, and I'll put it on our Rose Chat homepage. So
great.
It'll be there. Great. Well, this has been wonderful. So thank you so much. And I appreciate all you have done to bring beautiful and healthy roses to our back gardens.
Well, thank you.
Well, friends, this has been great. And thanks so much for listening today. Until next time, happy gardening from your friends at Rose Chat.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris Van Cleve and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat podcast. The Rose Chat podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.